Welcome to the Highway Church of Christ in Benton, Arkansas.
Several weeks ago, our school website was down for a few days for maintenance. Now, as most universities are now, all of our assignments are online. And they're turned in online on the school website. And so for 2 days, we were going to be in trouble. And what our professors decided was the most appropriate action, what these very intelligent people with PhDs beside their name decided was the best thing to do, would be to just submit all of our assignments on Facebook and have us turn them all in on Facebook. That would have worked fine had I had a Facebook account. So there was one day, several months ago, that I did have a Facebook. And I sat down and I thought, all right, Zach, you can do this. It only needed 4 things to make a Facebook account. It needs a name, it needs a birthday, it needs a gender, and it needs a valid email address. Not that complicated. And so I typed in my name, I put in my birthday, and I went to the box where it's got gender, and there's a little down arrow. And you click that arrow and it pulls up a list to choose from, right? And as I go to click that, I'm thinking, all right, there's probably going to be 3, maybe 4 options. There's male, there's female, then there's typically like an other or a private or prefer not to specify, something along those lines. So I click that down arrow and this list pops up. And I sat there for a couple minutes and looked at the list, because I was counting how many options were on that list. And I give you a hint, it's not because I was a slow counter. It's because there were 58 genders listed for me to choose from. You heard that right. There were 58 genders listed for me to choose from. And I got a kind of a kick out of that. And I decided to write some of them down. There was agender, androgynous, bigender, cisgender, cis female, cis man, cis male, cis woman, cis boy, cis girl, several other pronouns. There was a cisgender female, cisgender male, man, woman, a female to male, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, gender questioning, gender variant, gender queer, intersex, male to female, neither. New choice, non-binary, other, pangender, trans with a plus sign, trans female, male man, person, woman, boy, girl, trans feminine, transgender female, man, all the other pronouns, trans masculine, transsexual, and two-spirited. And there are several more on that list there. And that kind of got me to thinking, that put several questions in my mind. How did we get here? How did we reach this point? And a more important question than that, where are we going? If you would have asked society 100 years ago, do you think that we're going to have this kind of an issue in the United States? Do you think they would have even thought in a million years something like this would be a problem? I wouldn't think so. So what does that say for 100 years from now? What's left? Pedophilia? Bestiality? Where do we go from here? And then, even more importantly than that, as Christians, what is our duty and what can we do to face this giant? What can we do about this? I don't want this to be the future my children grow up in, or their grandchildren. There needs to be a stop somewhere. Thankfully, we have advice given to us from the one that created human beings, from the one that knows society and the way people think better than anybody else. He sent us here with an owner's manual. It's got instructions in it. And He's given us a plan that we can follow when facing giants such as the one we face today. And it's a plan that if we follow each of the 5 steps in that plan, we're going to get the same result every time. It's been proven all throughout history, all throughout the Scriptures, and even today, it will still work. particular man in 1 Samuel 17, he faced a giant. His giant, unlike ours being metaphorical, his giant was quite literal. His was about 9 feet, 9 inches tall. I think the children here know who we're talking about. We're talking about David and Goliath. And if you'd like to turn there, we're going to spend some time looking at how David faced his giant. In 1 Samuel chapter 17. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, it's setting us up like we're almost watching an action movie. As we go down through here, you can just imagine sitting down in the movie theater, and you look at the screen and it's dark, and the sound begins to rumble, and the light and the sun begins to rise in the distance on the screen, and as it becomes daylight, you make out a mountain on one side, you make out a great mountain on the other side, and in between, there's a great valley. And as the sun begins to rise even more, you can see the glints of spears poking up through the fog, and armor and helmets and shields and swords and chariots. The sun rises some more, you begin to hear horses. And as the fog clears away, you see there's a great army set on one mountain. You see there's a great army set out in their vast battle array on the other mountain. And this great valley in between them, and you know that something is about to go down in this valley. And as you're watching and you see these two humongous armies, from one of the armies out steps this warrior who is unlike any that has ever been seen before. This warrior, as we read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 4, was 6 cubits and a span. There's a door right there, and that door is probably about 6 foot 8 inches. So if we look at that door and we think the top of that door plus 3 feet up in the air, that would be about 9 feet 8 inches. That's about how tall this warrior was. He was a big man. But not only that, we read later on that this warrior was trained from his youth to be a warrior. So he was large, he was a professional, and you know what? He had the absolute best gear to fight with that was available at the time. We read in verse 5, he had a helmet of brass upon his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. That's somewhere around 170 pounds. That's like carrying a small man on your back. He had greaves of brass upon his legs, target of brass between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one went before him to bear his shield. This was a great, mighty warrior. And what he does is he comes out and he begins to issue a challenge to the army on the other side of the valley. And you can just imagine what this giant's voice, his booming voice, must be like cannoning through this valley. As he comes out and he says in verse 8 to the armies of Israel, "Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and if he be able to come down and fight me," in verse 9, "and kill me, then we will be your servants." And he says, "But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants, and you will serve us." And he issues this great challenge to Israel, to the army of God, to King Saul. And you know what happens? In verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were scared. Even though they had the Lord on their side, even though they were the army of God, they feared this giant. And we know what happens. We know there's a shepherd boy that comes into the story. And he comes along to visit with his 3 elder brothers, to bring them food and supplies, to take a report back to his father. He leaves his sheep, and as he goes and he begins to talk with them in verse 23, this giant comes out again. Now, one thing we must note, this giant didn't just come out one time. This giant has come out for 40 days. And not only that, in verse 16, he drew near morning and evening, twice a day, for 40 times. So by the time David comes around, this giant has challenged the army of God 80 times, and no man has stood up to him. And so this shepherd boy comes along, and David hears these words, and in verse 26, at the end of verse 26, you know what he says when he hears that? He's appalled. And he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He says, "Who is this guy?" And he says, "How dare he mock my God?" David put his foot down. And what happens after that? We see that David has some opposition. And it's not from the enemy camp either, it's from his elder brother. Oftentimes you'll find that opposition doesn't just come from an enemy, but it can come from those around us that may doubt us, that may work to discourage us. And this is what happened with David, with his elder brother. But that goes along, and word gets around to King Saul that there's a man willing to challenge this great warrior in battle. And so he goes out and he speaks to King Saul. And before he goes to Saul, he tells Saul about how he's a servant, how he's a shepherd. And in verse 36, he says he slew both the lion and the bear. And he says this uncircumcised Philistine is no different than them. He's going to meet the same fate, seeing as he had to fight the armies of the living God. And in verse 37, David shows his confidence. He says, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." David placed his confidence not in his own ability, but in God's. And we're going to see the result of that very soon. And so we go on, and we're familiar with the story, how in verse 38, Saul arms David with the best armor, with his own armor, but David dismisses him. He says, "I have not proven this armor. I'm not familiar with this stuff. Shields and armor and bows and swords, those aren't the tools of a shepherd." David was familiar with the sling. And so he goes down in verse 40, and he chooses 5 smooth stones. He puts them in his shepherd's bag. He takes his sling, and the end of verse 40, he drew near to the Philistine. Have you ever noticed before that it says that David went to the Philistine? Goliath did not come to David. David went to face him. He wasn't afraid. And we go on in verse 43. In verse 43, as David is approaching this Philistine, he begins to mock David. And the Philistine says to David, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David. In verse 44, the Philistine said to David, "If you come to me, I will give your flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field." He says, "If you come to challenge me, the buzzards are going to eat your flesh and the dogs will pick your bones. Don't try to fight me." He taunts him. He ridicules him. He mocks him. Is David discouraged? Not one bit. He turns right around. In verse 45, David says to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts." David knew he had already won the battle. Because in verse 47, he says, "All this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. He will deliver." And we know that as David approached the Philistine, in verse 48, the Philistine arose, came nigh, drew to meet David. David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. No hesitation. David put his hand in his bag, verse 49, took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in the forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. And David wasn't done there. In verse 51, David ran, stood upon the Philistine, took his sword, drew it from the sheath thereof, slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And we see that immediately following that, there was a great victory for the army of Israel when they prevailed over the Philistines in the following verses. David conquered a giant. And you know, David followed the exact same steps that we can follow today to conquer our giants that we face. These steps are found in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. If you'd like to turn there, Keep your finger in 1 Samuel 17 because we'll be returning to it. There are 5 steps listed in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. If you're taking notes, it should be fairly straightforward. They're all listed right there. In 1 Corinthians 16:13, in God's formula for fighting giants, we read, "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong." And the next verse reads, "Let all your things be done with love." 5 steps for fighting giants. Step number 1, watch. Watch. If we look back at David, was David practiced in the art of watching? He was. Just as there is a difference between hearing and listening, there is a vivid distinction between watching and seeing. If we look back in 1 Samuel 17, in verse 35, he saw the lion and he saw the bear when they came to attack his father's flock. Had David not been watching, what would the fate of his flock have been? It would have been good. He was watching. He was aware. He was sober and vigilant, as Peter tells us to be. And he saw. And this same thing applied when he went to see his brothers, who had become desensitized to the threats of this Philistine, who for 40 days, morning and evening, 80 times, had heard this Philistine come out and challenge the armies of God. It was nothing new to them. But David was watching. And that's why in verse 26, at the end of verse 26, when he hears that challenge from the Philistine, he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is this guy? How dare he mock my God?" David was watching. He was ready. David recognized the evil, and he saw through the delusion that the rest of the armies of Israel were caught up in. You know, today, if we're not careful, sin can slip right under our nose. Sin can be all around us and us never see any of it. We need to watch. We need to be careful. And we need to remain vigilant so as not to become desensitized to the sin that is around us, much like the armies of Israel did. While going to a convention in downtown Little Rock, there was a little bit of traffic, and I decided to take what I thought would be a shortcut and go around a block or two. And I got caught up at an intersection, and the police had it stopped, and I sat at the very front of that intersection, and there was a gay pride parade that came by, and I watched the whole thing right in front of me, beginning to end. And these people came by, and they were in all manner of inappropriate dress. They had signs and flags and banners and drums, and they were marching and chanting. And I sat there and I watched that. It passed. I went on to where I was going. One of my buddies said, "Hey man, what took you so long?" I said, "It's just another gay pride parade." And then it hit me like a baseball bat in the forehead. I've become desensitized to this kind of stuff. We're constantly fed this particular lifestyle. We're constantly fed this through media, through our movies, through television shows, through the things we hear on the radio, through the world around us, through our education systems, that we become desensitized to this. And I really have to take a step back for a second and think, one, I feel sad. I'm disappointed because I recognize that those are souls marching through that street that Christ died for and He loved, and I love too. And two, the fact that this has become so commonplace. We're in Arkansas. We're in the Bible Belt of the United States. And this is marching through our streets, and it's accepted, and it's tolerated. Not only that, it's encouraged as normal, as good, and you are a horrible person if you say anything against it. We become desensitized. We need to watch. That's the first step to fighting our giants, to watch, to wake up and open our eyes. Step number 2 from 1 Corinthians 16:13. Once we watch, Paul tells us, number 2, stand fast in the faith. To stand fast in the faith, I think the English Standard Version words it in a way that we can better understand it. It reads, stand firm in the faith. To put our foot down, to draw the line in the sand, and to say enough is enough, and I'm not backing down. David certainly did this. And there's one particular soldier that comes to my mind that I've read about. They were a Cheyenne Indian soldier that they called dog soldiers. And the reason they called them that is what these Native American warriors would do is they would have a leather cord attached to their waist, And they would have a length of that cord, and at the end of that cord there would be a wooden stake. And when they were told to guard and defend the position, they would take that wooden stake, which they were attached to, and they would drive it into the ground so that they couldn't pull it out. And they would tether themselves to the ground so that they could only fight within that circle. And do you know what that meant? That meant they were going to stand firm. That meant that if they were to guard that position, they were not going anywhere, and they were going to guard it with everything they had until it killed them. They stood firm. David stood firm. David stood fast. In verse 37, David said, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." David was confident. He wasn't afraid. He knew the Lord would deliver him. And we can see David's mindset throughout the other scriptures as well. If we look at Psalm 1, which is written by David, we look at Psalm 1, verse 1, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night." In verse 3, "And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water." In verse 4, he juxtaposes that with the ungodly. He says the ungodly are not so. They're like the chaff which the wind driveth away. David stood fast. He stood fast like a tree. If after services you step out into this parking lot, you'll see a white pickup truck. And the tailgate of that white pickup truck has a big dent in it. And that dent is because trees stand firm. When we cut down a tree, even the stump is hard to get rid of, right? We either have to burn it down, or we have to grind it up piece by piece. Trees don't leave. We as Christians need to be the same way when facing giants. When we're talking about God, there is no compromise. It is either right or wrong. It's black and white. It's yes or no. There is no middle ground. I think about the church at Laodicea. They were not hot. They were not cold. They were lukewarm. And what did Christ say about them? "I'll spew you out of my mouth," right? He wasn't impressed. It's all nothing. I'm reminded of 1 Kings 18. We think about when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal. And they set up the two altars with the two sacrifices. And Elijah prayed to God to bring fire. And the prophets of Baal prayed to their gods to bring fire. And you remember what Elijah said right before he prayed to God? He said in 1 Kings 18:21, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." To stand fast. We see great men of the Bible doing this over and over. I'm reminded of Joshua. Familiar passage to all of us. Joshua 24. He tells Israel, "Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua stood fast. He was not going to be moved. He stood firm just like David did, and just like we need to today. In Matthew 6:24, we read that no man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. We as Christians must stand fast in order to face the giants that we face today. Watch ye, stand fast in the faith. And number 3, Paul tells us to quit you like men. Meaning, act like men. In verse 40 of 1 Samuel 17, when David was about to go to the Philistine, we noted that he drew near to the Philistine. He wasn't scared of it. And we note in verse 48, David ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Immediately after this great man had told him that the birds were going to eat him and the dogs were going to eat him, he ran to face him. David was a man. David quit you like men. David acted like a man. You know, when it comes to evil, if we stand idly by and watch, If we have a passive attitude or a passive behavior, will evil prevail or will good prevail? Evil will. You know, there's only so many groups when it comes to the issue of immorality. There's the first group, that would be the one that practices this particular lifestyle that we talked about. They make up about 0.6% of the population. I was surprised to learn that. 0.6%, even studies that are extremely biased only go up to about 2% of the population. So they're not really the biggest problem. But you have another group. There's 4 groups in total. There's the group that lives in it. There's the next group which condones it and encourages it and is militant to anybody that does not do the same. There's that group. They're not going to do anything about it. And then you have the group that's in the middle ground. You have the group that's neutral. The group that says, you know, I'm not going to practice in it, but I don't really care. It doesn't affect me. You just do you. And you know what? If I was not a Christian, that's probably where I would fall into. But I have a duty as a Christian in the next group, as one that loves God and loves my fellow man, to go to the lost, to teach them their ways, and encourage them to do right. You know, we see throughout the Scripture, we talked about this morning, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. We can't be neutral when it comes to things like this. If we look at Romans 1, in Romans 1, beginning in verse 20 through 24, it goes through vivid detail, describing this immorality. Wherefore God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Romans 1:26, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. And the women did change the natural use of that which is against nature. Likewise also the men. And it goes on and it continues to describe that. And then in verse 32, Romans 1:32, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. We cannot support evil and call ourselves Christians at the same time. We as Christians must stand up and do something. We must act like men, wake up and draw the line in the sand and say enough is enough. Because if we don't, who will? Step number 4, quit you like men. Step number 3. Step number 4, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians to be strong. To be strong. David certainly was very strong. In 1 Samuel 43, when we see all those threats that are given to him, that Goliath is going to give his flesh to the fowls of the air, to the beasts of the field, he immediately turns it around and he gives it right back to him. He wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He knew that God was on his side. We must be strong. In Psalm 144, verse 1, we see David's mentality when it comes to wars. He says, blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. My goodness, my fortress, my high tower, my deliverer, my shield. Get this. And he in whom I trust. David's confidence in battle was not in his ability. David's confidence when facing this giant was not in his ability to sling rocks. It was in God. And that's where it remained, as he wrote about, much like it ought to be for us today when facing our giants. We must be strong because the Christian path is not one for the weak. In Luke 9:23, we read, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. It takes spiritual strength to deny yourself. It takes spiritual strength to take up your cross. It takes spiritual strength to take up your cross daily, over and over and over as the world beats you down, to take it up daily. And it takes spiritual strength to follow Christ. You know, God gave us all He had. He gave us His only Son. And if we want to receive what He received, we have to take the path that He took. If we want to receive the crown that He wears, we have to bear the burden that He bore. We have to bear the cross that He bore, and that's not something that we can do if we are spiritually weak. We must be strong to face giants, and if we do that, God promises us in James 1:12, He says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive that crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love Him. We sing, oh, how I love Jesus. And we say that, we think that, we love Jesus. What does that mean? He says, John 13:14, if you love me, keep my commandments. And he says, you're my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. John 14:13. Loving Jesus and obeying Jesus go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. We must be strong to face our giants. Watch. Quit you like men. Be strong. Stand fast in the faith. And then number 5, the 5th step that Paul tells us about for facing giants. Let all your things be done with love. You know, this step is one that if it's left out, then the previous 4 steps can often cause more harm than they cause good. If we don't do our things with love, then a lot of times we can be rejected, and people won't want to hear what we have to say, even if it's out of love for them. In 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 and 10, we read about David and the armies of Israel and Saul coming back from battle. And the women were dancing and singing, and do you remember what they said? They sang about Saul, and they said, Saul hath slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. I want to present to you the idea that David was, as we ought to be, a warrior and a poet. David was this great warrior that slew tens of thousands. This same man with blood on his hands wrote the 23rd Psalm. Wrote this beautiful passage that we read at funerals, that can bring tears in our eyes, that we have songs for. The same man. We're talking about the same shepherd that slew a lion and slew a bear. He was a warrior. He was soft enough to tend to his father's sheep and to tend to a beautiful flock of lambs. We're talking about the same man that chopped off the head of the giant. This same man is the same man that wrote the beautiful songs that we read about today. This is the same man that played a harp for the king when he was troubled and made beautiful music to comfort him. David was a warrior and a poet. You know, there's a lot of confusion today about how we can fix some of the problems we see in the world. There is a group that thinks along the lines that if rape, murder, and war all have one thing in common, that being men, then we need to make men less like men, and that's going to fix rape, murder, and war. And that's going to fix crime and violence, because those are traits that are masculine. And so this group goes about to indoctrinate children. This group goes about to teach kindergartners that it's okay to have 2 mommies. It's okay to have 2 daddies. This group goes about to read books to first graders that say that it's fine and dandy for a boy to go to school wearing a skirt and makeup. These are the same groups that discourage masculine traits and behaviors on the playground. The groups that will suspend 2nd graders for playing finger guns during recess. The group that will discourage any kind of sport that involves competition because everybody's a winner. Everybody gets a trophy. These people that do anything they can to abolish masculine traits with the hope of stopping the aggressive behavior that we see in evil men. But here's the problem with that. Evil men do not become good when they stop being men. Evil men become good when they stop being evil. And in order to get rid of evil men, that requires action by strong men. If it wasn't for strong men, we would be speaking German today. You know, those same traits that lead a man to go for conquest and seek action to be a hero are the same traits that cause a firefighter to run into a building to save a child that he doesn't even know, to risk his own life for some stranger's child. Those same traits are the traits of a soldier that sacrifices his life for his fellow soldiers, for his family back at home. Those same traits are the one that leads a father to protect, to provide, and to lead his family. And if we lack those, you know what we have? We're going to have a generation of weak men. A generation of unsatisfied women that can't find husbands that can lead and protect and provide for them. And a generation of boys and girls that are so confused so as not to know whether they're a boy or a girl. And that's not the future we like to have. We need to do all things in love. You know, Jesus was probably the most manliest man, was definitely the most manliest man that has ever been. We often have this picture of Jesus that we see as some tiny, effeminate, almost fluorescently white, long-haired hippie hanging on a cross with his bones showing. You know, Jesus was a carpenter. And that would have involved stonework. Have you ever shaken hands with a stoneworker? It's like rubbing sandpaper. These are big men. They fling bricks around. They have muscle. They have grip strength. Jesus was a man. You know, he was described, as David was a warrior poet, that Jesus was described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And at the same time as being this fierce fighting animal, he was the Lamb of God, a warrior and a poet. You know, sometimes it is most appropriate to put our foot down, to point our finger and to say, this is enough, this is wrong, and I'm not having any more of it. How dare you mock my God? There's also a time where it's appropriate to sit down, to say, my friend, I love you. And because I love you, and because I want you to enjoy an eternity in glory with God, we need to talk about the Bible. Quitting you like men, doing all things with love are not exclusive terms. They are things that must go hand in hand to be done well. We must remember our goal. We have two goals here on this earth. The first one is to get ourselves to heaven. You know, my number one goal, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I want to think about is I'm going to go to heaven. And there's nothing Satan can do about it. I've got God on my side, and if God be for us, who can be against us? I'm going to heaven. And our second goal ought to be that I'm going to take as many people with me that I can, no matter what the cost is, whether that be shame from those around us, whether that be called intolerant or hateful. We know what our goal is, and we do it with a love for man because we love our fellow man. The greatest commandment, Matthew 22:39, Jesus tells us, love the God, Lord your God, with all your heart, soul, and mind. He says to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, on these commandments hang all the law and the prophets. To love God, we talked about, is to keep his commandments. To love your neighbor is to seek the lost and want the same fate for them as for yourself. You know, Christ died for all men. He died and bled to cover my sin, just like he bled to cover your sin, just like he bled to cover the sin of anyone else. And if we love him and keep his commandments, we're going to hear his word, Romans 10:17. We're going to believe it, John 3:16. We're going to repent of our sins, Luke 13:3. We're going to confess our faith before men and be proud of it, Matthew 10:32. And if we do that, he says that he will confess us before our Father in heaven. We're going to be baptized for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38. And then once we're added to the Lord's church in baptism, as we read in Acts 2:47, if we're faithful unto death, Revelation 2:10, he promises us a crown of life. And making a deal with God is a good one, because God keeps his promises. You know, it's hard to save somebody who's drowning if we don't know how to swim. If tonight you have any need, won't you come forward? Won't you stand fast in the faith? Watch, be strong, quit you like men. Do it with a love for God. As together we stand and as we sing.
Amen.